Welcome to the Janome studio. In this video tutorial, we'll be talking about how to bind a quilt that has rounded corners. And this is also a great tutorial for a quilt that might be in the shape of a circle or an oval or really any quilt that has rounded edges. Okay, so we've come to the point, the most exciting point in quilting, where we have our masterpiece quilted and now we're ready to put the binding on. So, say you've never done rounded edges before, it's a really simple technique and you don't have to worry about mitering your corners, which can be a little tricky if you're a beginner. So for this tutorial, all you need to do to round the corners of your quilt is find a circle with a circumference that you like. It can be a plate, it can be a bowl, it can be anything that's circular just around the house that you have laying around, or you can print up a template. But use that and you'll just set it on the corner of the quilt and then trace and trim that away. And then you'll have these really nice matched rounded edges of your quilt. And whenever you have rounded edges or a circular quilt or an oval quilt or anything like that, it's really important that you cut your binding at a 45-degree angle to the selvage. And so that's typically called bias binding. And it isn't necessary to use bias binding on standard binding, like a quilt that has just straight edges and 90-degree corners. But for rounded edges, it's important because the fabric needs to have a little bit of give. So this piece of binding is cut at a 45-degree angle to the selvage. This is a bias cut. And you can see whenever I stretch it, I'm not really pulling this very hard. You can definitely see it's got quite a bit of give to it. And so what you'll need to do next is you'll measure the perimeter of your quilt after it's been quilted. And the reason for that is you can see this piece is pretty densely quilted. And if I started out with a 20-inch by 20-inch square and I quilted this even more densely, it would make the quilt top shrink, or the actual quilt shrink. And so it may not be 20 inches by 20 inches anymore. So measure the perimeter of your quilt now that you've got your rounded edges and add 10 inches to that measurement. And I like to use 10 inches. It's just a good measurement because it gives you a little bit of excess, but not so much that you're wasting a lot of fabric. So once you have that measurement, you're going to cut your bias strips and you're going to cut them 2.5 inches wide. So that's how wide this piece of fabric is. It's 2.5 inches wide whenever I open it out. And once you make your cuts, you just need to cut enough so that you have the perimeter measurement of your quilt plus the 10 inches. And for more information on pressing your seams, you can refer to the tips linked below. Okay, so you've got your bias binding prepared, and once you've sewn them all together and pressed, you want to make sure that you also fold it in half and press wrong sides together, and then you're going to be ready to go. So now that we've prepped our binding, we've got our quilt sandwich quilted and ready to be bound. The next thing that we need to do is we're going to open out the starting point of our binding, and I like to use some sort of erasable marking pen for this, but what we need to do is we need to make a diagonal cut. And so I'm just going to mark a little reference line to help me know where I need to cut. I'm just eyeballing that. That might not be a precise 45-degree angle, but it's pretty close. And so now I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm going to trim this away. And we can just get rid of that. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to fold over about 3/8 of an inch of this edge that I just cut. And I'm going to pin or clip it in place. And I like to use these little binding clips because whenever I use pins, sometimes I'll accidentally sew over them with the sewing machine. And that's really not great for your machine or your pins, your machine specifically. And so these binding clips are great because they're very visible and pretty much impossible to sew over. And so now that I've done that, you can see I have this little tail hanging over. We're gonna go ahead and trim that away as well. Okay, and now we're ready to start attaching the binding. Whenever we're starting and finishing the binding by machine, it's important that we start on the back side of the quilt. So this blue color, we're gonna say is the back of my quilt. So we're gonna take the folded edge of the binding and we're going to align the raw edge with the raw edge of the quilt. And I'm gonna take some more of these little clips and I'm gonna secure just the first few inches. And we're going to be taking this to the machine in just a minute, but first I'm gonna tell you what we're gonna be doing. To start with, we're gonna be securing this little flap. We're gonna sew 4 to 5 inches of this length at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you're gonna back stitch at the start and stop, and you're gonna make sure that you're stitching down this folded flap that we just created. So let's go ahead and take this to the machine. Okay, so now that we've put on our 1/4 inch foot and we've selected our 1/4 inch stitch, we're ready to start sewing the binding down. And before we begin, I'm gonna remove a couple of binding clips to get those out of the way, and I'm gonna position the folded edge of the binding right under the foot. And then I'm gonna press the presser foot down button, and I'm gonna hold on to my top thread while I press the needle down button, and then press needle up. So that's gonna pull that bobbin thread up to the top. And now I'm gonna secure both of those while I press the needle down button again. And now I'm going to move that thread around, and I'm gonna back stitch a few stitches to secure that in place. And we're gonna stop sewing once we get to the folded edge of the bias binding. And I will say that whenever you're sewing the curves, it helps if you attach the knee lift to the machine, because it frees up both your hands so that you can be adjusting the binding if you need to around the curves. Okay, so I'm gonna remove these binding clips that are in the way on the raw edge, and now we're gonna start sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we're gonna sew 4 to 5 inches with the binding open the way that it is. Okay, and now we're gonna back stitch a few stitches. And now we're gonna snip the threads. Okay, so the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna take off that binding clip, and we're gonna now fold this binding over. I'm gonna leave this clip here for a reference just for a second. So we're gonna fold this back down, and we're making sure that this 3/8 of an inch folded edge is still folded down when we're folding that over. Okay, so I'm gonna put a clip there to keep that secure. And this clip is here to tell us where we're gonna start sewing. So we're not gonna sew above this line. And the reason we're doing that is we're leaving a little sleeve open so that we can insert the other end of the binding when we get done sewing all the way around into this little sleeve. Makes for a really nice finish. And now I'm gonna continue clipping this bias to the curved edge. And I like to clip just a few inches at a time, like 8 to 10 inches at a time, because it does tend to stretch, and you don't necessarily want to clip all the way around and then have to readjust it as you sew. Okay, so I'm gonna start sewing below this clip. So I'm gonna remove that, put it under my presser foot, and I'm sewing through all the layers now. And I'm gonna stitch a few forward. And now I'm gonna stitch a few back stitches to secure that in place. Okay, now we're ready to start sewing all the way around. Okay, so now that we have sewn our binding to the back side of our quilt at the machine with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, we're ready to go ahead and get to the best part. So now we can flip our quilt over to the front, and we're gonna take this bias edge and we're just going to flip it. We're gonna flip the folded edge over to the right side of the quilt. And this is truly the best part. This is my favorite part because this bias binding, it automatically kind of rolls in on itself. So it has a really nice finish and it lays down really smooth and flat. And you can learn more about pressing the folded edge of your bias binding down in the Just So You Know video linked below. So we're going to fold this down all the way around. And I love to use these binding clips to keep everything nice and neat and in place. Okay, so I've got my bias binding clipped all the way around the quilt, and now we're ready to take it to the machine to sew. Okay, now that we're at the machine, we're gonna change our 1/4 inch foot to the standard presser foot or foot A. And so I'm gonna drop that 1/4 inch foot down. And I've selected stitch number 1 to change our stitches to the standard straight stitch for a top stitch. And now I'm gonna change my bobbin thread to a color that matches the back of my quilt so that the thread blends in really well. So we're gonna go ahead and bring the quilt over. I actually like to start at the place where we tucked the binding in. So I'm gonna find a spot that doesn't have binding clips in between it, and I'm gonna go ahead and lower the presser foot. I'm gonna grab my top thread, which is like a silver color to kind of blend in with my binding fabric. And I'm going to bring my bobbin thread to the top, press the needle down button again, and I'm gonna sew a few stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch a few stitches to secure my threads. Okay, now I'm sewing forward, and I'm top stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the folded edge of the bias binding. So now that you've seen how easy it is to apply a bias binding to a quilt with rounded edges, I hope that you'll really challenge yourself to try this technique on your next quilt and master it. Thanks so much for joining us.